regime.
There's dormitories, there's what look to be classrooms, there's workshops. It's a big mystery.
The eerie streets of a sunken pirate city in the Caribbean.
The harbor walls are crumbling into the sea, and the whole area has been left to collapse.
An infamous plantation in America's deep south.
There is a sense of foreboding that something might have happened here, that you can't quite figure out what.
And a shadowy subterranean complex that helped win a war.
Looking at these doors, never in your wildest dreams could you imagine what lies beyond.
Decaying relics and ruins of lost worlds. They were forged by the passing years and are now haunted by the past. Their secrets are waiting to be revealed. In the middle of the Adriatic Sea, near the coast of Croatia, is an island few holidaymakers dare to visit.
It's a moonscape, barren. There are mountains of rock piled up here or there. It's a palette of gray and white.
It's pretty barren. There's not a lot of tree cover for shade or for breaking the wind.
This is an island that is not the least bit welcoming. It is stark, it is burned, and it's dead.
Stretching up the hillside is a series of stepped ruins, really just the outlines of walls.
If you look a little more closely, you start noticing some sinister elements. As you see this place surrounded by fencing, machine gun posts, and barbed wire. And the mystery kind of thickens.
This was a place built for a dark purpose.
This is an island dedicated to breaking the human spirit. This is a place designed to dehumanize.
What was this settlement used for? Who lived here? And were they being held against their will? This sterile rocky outcrop is Goli Otok. Local historian Darko Babalyak has spent many years exploring it.
This is an island where paranoia and violence reached their height.
The more you investigate the island, the more intriguing it becomes.
As you get closer, there's, sleeping quarters, there's an auditorium. It's hard to know what this place is.
There is no readily apparent reason why you would build this semi-industrial facility on an island in the middle of the sea.
Goli Otok's isolated location is key to understanding its past.
Because it's off the coast, anything can happen out there. The fate of the people there will never be known.
Look at the bunkers. This is a place that is designed to be patrolled, designed to be defended.
But it's not in any way clear what was worth guarding and patrolling here.
In fact, Goli Otok was a brutal prison, which was sometimes called the Croatian Alcatraz.
The first prisoners arrived on this island on July 9th, 1949. After that, around 12,000 convicts passed through this place, and they built everything that you can see here.
But why did someone go to such lengths to build a prison on this barren rock, far out to sea and way out of sight? After After the Second World War, Goli Otok was part of communist Yugoslavia, which was then closely aligned with Moscow. But in 1949, the infamous dictator Marshal Josip Tito split Yugoslavia away from the Soviet Union and its leader, Joseph Stalin. Not all Yugoslavians agreed with Tito's decision. Many wanted Soviet-style communism to remain. But the ruthless dictator had a harsh way of dealing with dissenters.
Tito wants to be able to take people he thinks are loyal to Stalin and make them disappear.
Tito's cold-blooded pursuit of power saw him turn upon his own people. He had thousands of political prisoners rounded up and sent here to the prison on Goli Otok. This is Tito's Gulag.
The buildings are a stark reminder of the immense paranoia of a regime that didn't trust its own people.
They'd spend years living under the harshest conditions, huddling on this limestone island protected by a few blocks, being worked nearly to death.
The punishing regime saw inmates digging a huge network of tunnels and forced to construct the very fortifications that were keeping them in prison.
There are more than 100 bunkers on this island. Many were used to stop prisoners escaping.
Those unfortunate enough to end up here were subjected to Tito's ruthless re-education program, a sinister operation that turned progressively darker.
Here is a place that was built up, made almost brutally magnificent in its ability to cause people misery and pain so that they would be compliant.
Yugoslavia's notorious secret police kept a close watch on the whole thing. Fear of being snatched away and sent to Goli Otok became part of Yugoslav life.
The psychological trauma is immense. Imagine being literally disappeared, being seized for crimes you don't even know you're being accused of so quickly and so secretly that even your friends and family don't know where you've gone. None of those who arrived at this prison had actually been tried in court. They were simply arrested and seized and sent here, and often on the slightest pretext for just discussing other communist countries openly. Sometimes people executed their personal grudges by informing upon people that had not really committed any political crimes. They just wanted to see them sent to Goli Otok.
The prison had a unique way of maintaining discipline among its inmates. Although a small number of senior officials were placed in charge of the Gulag, they weren't responsible for keeping order.
The prison discipline was actually carried out in large part by the inmates themselves. So when newcomers arrived, the older inmates were forced to whip them as they passed by.
Those who survived sometimes rose through the ranks to mete out their own form of brutality as barrack supervisors.
The barrack supervisor was the master of life and death. He could order any prisoner to viciously beat another.
These brutal conditions created a kind of prison hierarchy where prisoners were encouraged to humiliate each other, to inform on one another, to beat one another.
Everybody was an informer. Everybody was an abuser. Everybody was violent. And nobody felt safe.
About 600 died on the island, which means, thousands returned to the mainland after being broken and re-educated. But those who came back, they didn't dare say a word.
What were they afraid of? What if someone informed on them again and they were returned to Goli Otok?
These fears rippled through Yugoslav society until 1989, when the fall of the Berlin Wall marked the beginning of the end for the communist system. Tito's Gulag was closed down. Today, the crumbling buildings of Goli Otok are a haunting reminder of Tito's shocking totalitarian regime.
All of us in the West, we allowed ourselves to think that unlike the other communist dictatorships, Tito's dictatorship was not founded on brutality and prison camps. And of course, we were wrong.
In the swampy wetlands of Louisiana in the USA lies a sprawling site with an extraordinary story to tell.
It seems entirely otherworldly because you've got the bayou, you've got the strange wildlife, you've got snakes crawling through the grass, you've got crocodiles. Yeah, it's pretty forbidding.
In this landscape, not only do you have the remains of buildings like brick foundations barely exposed, you also have existing structures, very, very simple wooden structures, simple cabins. They're, placed one here in a field, one a little bit further away, one a bit further away.
These are very, very basic living quarters, very simple shacks, quickly thrown together and barely hanging together today.
These buildings in Louisiana, USA, and the abandoned machinery that lies submerged in the steaming swamps around them are clues about a murky history.
In the distance, you can see some kind of a crane or industrial facility and some other heavy equipment laying around in state of disrepair. So it looks like we're coming upon a basic agricultural establishment, but for what exactly?
There is a sense of foreboding that something might have happened here, that you can't quite figure out what.
Who were the workers that called this place home? And how were their lives entwined with the war that divided America? This place is certainly a puzzle. Perhaps it has an industrial past. A small train and other assorted bits of machinery rust away in the humid southern climate. But the cluster of shacks and a deserted school hint at a lost community. Paul Leslie is a local historian who has spent years studying the history here.
I came here around 1977, and so I pretty much discovered it then, and I was just completely stunned by the presence of so many buildings. It was like a time capsule.
The story begins with a product that was in demand across the world: sugar.
What we're seeing here is a sugar plantation, a kind of agriculture that was very common in the U.S. in the 19th century and before.
And sugar was really an integral part of the Louisiana economy because it was the ultimate cash crop.
This isn't just any sugar plantation, it's Laurel Valley, and it was once one of the largest plantations in North America.
In the 1830s, a family by the name of Tucker arrived and took over this land and began building up the plantation.
But their ambition came with a high price.
The Tucker family arrived with a couple of dozen slaves. Within 20 years, they have almost 170 slaves. It's a phenomenally large slave-holding family.
The process of making sugar was a really brutal one, and it was incredibly difficult for the laborers involved.
At the heart of the operation was the mill.
This is the old sugar mill. It's built in the 1840s, built with bricks that were made on the plantation by the slaves. and then assembled painstakingly something like 366,000 slave-made bricks.
The mill was operating 24 hours a day. It never shut down unless equipment broke. A train would come in from down below us. It would have boxcars, and they would stop underneath the crane. Crane would take the cane, put it in a trough. They'd wash the cane, bring it into the mill, crush it, and then from then, make sugar.
The working day was brutal.
The day here at Laurel Valley was one that started at around 7:30 and ended close to 8 o'clock. It wasn't an uncommon thing to have people plowing in the fields at night. As far as the working conditions, they were hard. The average life expectancy was around 25 years of age.
This is slave labor in some very difficult conditions down here in the swamps with mosquitoes and malaria and the blazing sun. So there was no easy place to be a slave, but this is probably one of the worst places.
Workers started at very young age, about 8, 9, 10.
Life as a slave was so harsh that some couldn't bear to bring a child into the world.
You have infamous stories of mothers deciding to commit infanticide rather than subject a child to slavery.
The deserted structures at Laurel Valley hint at the cruelties of day-to-day life.
Imagine living in these swamps in one of these primitive houses, no screens on the windows to keep out the mosquitoes. There were probably, 5 people to a room. Very, very primitive and difficult conditions.
But a violent series of events would soon change America, the Tuckers, and the people they had enslaved.
The Southerners, they saw slavery as the bedrock of their economy, and it's sort of an economic nonsense in a way, because it's been proven over and over that slavery was an inefficient way to run anything. And yet, slavery had become so entwined with Southern culture.
Few families felt more strongly about this than the Tuckers. In 1861, the Civil War broke out. And in 1863, Caleb Tucker left Laurel Valley and went off to join the Confederate Army.
For a man like Caleb Tucker, who has considerable slave holdings, the notion of emancipating his enslaved labor force is akin to bankrupting himself.
After the Union won the war, Tucker's Confederate background was to have a catastrophic effect on his plantation.
The local Union authorities exacted real retribution on him. We know for a fact that Union authorities, plundered the plantation. So as a result, the plantation in the latter stages of the Civil War really falls upon hard times.
Eventually, the Tuckers sold the plantation, and the Laurel Valley slaves were set free. But any hopes of a better life soon vanished.
The period just after the Civil War is really heartbreaking, because there was such an opportunity to give these former slaves some semblance of their rights. They were on their way to something that looked like at least a somewhat freer society and somewhat more opportunity. But this period of Reconstruction didn't last very long.
Racial hatred and low wages meant that the working conditions for the Laurel Valley slaves in Louisiana hardly improved. In 1887, they staged a mass strike, and an all-white militia was sent to crush it.
They not only try to kill strikers, they also end up massacring Black civilians, Black people who are in the town. And so historians don't have a very strong sense of exactly how many Blacks were killed. But it was dozens, it was scores of people being murdered, being slaughtered.
The strikers had little choice but to return to work in the same sugar fields, and the plantation began to thrive again. boom between 1890 and 1924 saw more building and development.
They had huge cranes for loading the cane and loading the product. They had miles of railroad tracks. They had to move around a lot of material, and they were willing to invest a lot in the infrastructure to make that happen.
But the Great Depression of the 1930s brought economic disaster to the sugar industry and southern Louisiana. Eventually, the workers' cabins became empty and the sugar mill closed for good. Today, Laurel Valley still stands. The fields are still used to grow sugarcane, but the slave houses now lie deserted.
This particular site is a window into a part of our history, a part of world history. And as tragic as it is, it's also really important to recognize that it's a story that needs to be told.
Perched on a remote coastline in the Scottish Highlands is a collection of buildings that keeps silent watch over the sea.
Up on the cliffs, you're swept away by the natural beauty. But if you look down at your feet, you'll find concrete foundations. Man's been here, and he's created things and then taken them away.
But that's not the only mystery in these faraway foothills. Concealed in dense grassland is a fascinating doorway to the past.
If you don't know what you're looking for, you are never going to find it in this landscape.
You can just about make out big steel doors that appear to lead right into the mountainside. Never in your wildest dreams could you imagine what lies beyond.
Whatever is there is too secret to appear on local maps.
It's what you don't see that's even more impressive about this complex. Secrecy was very, very key to the entire operation.
What's there is enormous.
It's when you make a noise that you realize the scale of this place.
They represent 6 cathedrals buried in the Scottish mountain.
Why go out of your way to hide this huge facility? And what is its connection to the cliff-top ruins? The link between the gateway in the woods and the cliff-top structures begins 2 miles away with some vast metal drums in the town of Invergordon.
You're looking at a kind of industrial complex, and it's a very, very important site.
You suddenly realize there are these massive round structures heading off as far as the eye can see.
Rows and rows of these rusting circular domes stretch out into the distance.
Military archaeologist Alan Kilpatrick has made extensive studies of the area.
The site is very impressive. Its engineering, its quality of its engineering is absolutely first rate.
It all dates back to the early 20th century.
Built initially in 1913, the fact that they're still here today, having had no maintenance for over 25 years or thereabouts, they're still standing in amazing condition.
Inside these circular domes, it's almost pitch black and covered in this almost powdery white substance. It's quite spooky.
The white powder is organic material which confirms that these tanks have been empty for years. But they were once filled with the 20th century's black gold, oil. The largest of these enormous steel tanks is almost 120 feet high and 45 feet wide. The whole fuel depot once held hundreds of thousands of tons of oil.
You had 44 oil tanks constructed. Each one of these tanks contained 5,000 tons of fuel oil.
So what happened to the oil? And what connects it to the coastal ruins and the dark secret in the mountainside? During the First World War, this was a key Royal Navy facility.
When you consider the importance of fuel to the Navy, it's as important as ammunition or guns. No fuel, no fleet.
Invergordon sits on the Cromarty Firth, a deep island waterway that leads out to the North Sea.
Invergordon was really, really important strategically, that ships could slip in under the cover of darkness, fuel up, and then disappear off.
Thanks to Invergordon, the Royal Navy was able to make a huge contribution to the victory over Germany. But the cliff-top structures east of Invergordon suggest that the fuel depot later came under threat. These are the remains of the North Sutor Coast Battery. Originally built in 1913, by the start of the Second World War, it had been upgraded to guard against a new threat, the Navy's precious oil.
All this effort was to try and protect it from aerial attack, because aerial attack was the major threat to the Royal Navy.
When Germany invaded Norway in 1941, it gained control of a coastline that was within striking distance of Scotland.
In February 1941, a Junkers 88 came tearing in over Invergordon. It carried out a solo attack, dropping 2 500-pound bombs.
It collapsed Tank 13, spilling oil down the adjacent railway line and down into the Firth itself. Tank 13 was never rebuilt, so now it is a gap in the tank farm.
The British had foreseen the dangers, and for the previous 4 years had been building a place nearby to store even more fuel. But there are no signs of the site.
If you didn't know where to locate this entrance, you wouldn't know this place even existed.
There is a door in the mountainside made out of incredibly thick steel and very firmly bolted to the concrete.
Behind this unassuming portal into this hillside lies one of the finest examples of civil engineering. This is one of 2 tunnels that lead into this remote highland hillside, 500 feet above Invergordon.
It's only by venturing deeper that the true nature of the complex is revealed.
The access tunnel here is over 220 meters long.
A few meters later, and the tunnel seems to end entirely.
Once you get to the end of that corridor, you realize there is another way forward, but it's through a much, much smaller pipeline.
And the staff would have to lie flat on this wheeled board that they'd then be pushed through the pipes.
They would eventually emerge into a monstrous void.
This space, which is ahead of me, is vast. It is the size, in fact, actually bigger than a medieval cathedral. The sheer size of this is 780 feet long by 30 feet wide by 52 feet high. It really is an impressive piece of engineering.
This is just one of 6 tanks that make up the Inchindown underground fuel depot. The first was completed in 1941, and each one held 5.6 million gallons of fuel. At more than 400 feet below ground, no German bomb could touch it. A system of pumps and piping carried the fuel down to Invergordon.
The fuel flowed down 4 miles of pipes from the tanks down to the naval base.
600 men were involved. Massive amount of tunneling. 250,000 cubic meters of sandstone removed from this facility.
This impressive feat of engineering would soon play a critical role in the largest seaborne invasion in history.
In World War II, this one facility can support the fleet for considerable time. And without bases like this, you have no Royal Navy.
In 1944, many of the vessels heading south towards the beaches of Normandy for the D-Day landings refueled here at Invergordon. It was a crucial part of the naval infrastructure.
And it was critical to the final Allied victory in the Second World War. After the war, the world-class engineering behind the Inchindown oil tanks saw them continue to play an important military role.
This facility was all through the Cold War a very, very important and very secure site for your fuel storage for logistics for the Navy.
There were plans to upgrade the site for use by NATO, but these plans were later abandoned, and in 2002, the site was officially closed.
But that is an incredible journey and an amazing lifespan for something that was first constructed in 1941.
The vast Inchindown oil tanks continue to break records to this very day, including what's believed to be the longest-lasting reverberation ever recorded.
It measured about 117 seconds of reverberance before the sound finally tailed to nothing.
In the south of Jamaica, at the mouth of Kingston Harbor, a windswept Caribbean village hides a turbulent past.
It's a thin peninsula stretching out into the sea. You can see from the way the wind whips the trees that this is an exposed area.
A long building stretches along the coastline. The plaster is peeling off the walls, and it's been battered by the elements.
Scattered clues suggest a military connection.
You've got imposing walls, and there's a tower with some arches. There's a huge courtyard with strange wooden shapes in the floor.
Turn a corner, and there's a line of cannons in various states of disrepair. Some rusting, some looking as though they're ready to fire.
Further exploration reveals that something went seriously wrong.
You can see that the whole building has been upended on one side, but remains perfectly intact. What force could have moved the entire structure?
The way the harbor walls are crumbling into the sea and the whole place being so quiet, there's a real sense that something happened here, that we're not getting the full picture, that there's something under the water.
How did the relics of man-made structures end up beneath the waves? What was this mysterious settlement? An incongruous red brick fort overshadows the sleepy harbor, hinting that the focus here has not always been on fishing.
This is a military space, but what period it is from and what they are protecting is not immediately apparent.
What was so worth defending on the far-flung Jamaican coast?
This point is right in the middle of the Caribbean's busiest trading routes of the 17th century. This meant money, and money always needs defending.
This is Port Royal. 400 years ago, this forgotten backwater was the jewel of the Caribbean. Local archaeologist Doric Gray explains how the English snatched it from Spanish hands.
When the English captured Jamaica in 1655, one of the first things they started to do was to build a fort. All it was a stockade with wood that the soldiers were to defend the island. And what is left of it is that semicircular you see there. This was the first English structure in Jamaica that was built.
The fort rapidly expanded, and so did the town. And Port Royal soon became one of the most important cities in the world.
When it was built, this town was bigger than Boston and had more money than all of London.
But this prize so far from home wasn't easy for the English to protect.
They then did something incredibly risky and unusual. They sent an open invitation to the most lawless and ruthless criminals on the planet to come and make it their home. Pirates.
The second half of the 17th century was the golden age for pirates, with as many as 5,000 at large on the oceans. Port Royal became their capital. Were the abandoned structures that litter Port Royal home to these buccaneers?
Now just imagine, these were rowdy persons, and they were pirates operating on behalf of the English.
It seems like a crazy idea, but it was a better the devil you know move. By getting these libertarians on their side, the British were asking them to attack the Spanish ships, thereby protecting their own trade and diminishing their enemies.
Port Royal flourished under pirate rule, eventually growing into an outlaw town of some 8,000 people.
The Caribbean was like the Wild West of the 17th century, and Port Royal was like Dodge City.
It was said that 1 in 4 buildings in Port Royal was a bar or a brothel. This city was known around the world as the Wicked City.
Clues about the city's fate lie beneath the waves. There was something far more menacing on the horizon that neither the British nor their pirate army could have foreseen. The remains of abandoned streets have been found in the murky waters that surround the pirate city of Port Royal in the Caribbean. And the holes in the centuries-old walls show where most of it disappeared.
If you look, you'll see 3 spaces in the wall right here. This, the largest one, is where we have Lime Street. Lime Street was one of the most important streets in Port Royal.
Why did Port Royal vanish below the waves? A curious building tilting precariously into Jamaica's soft, sandy rock is proof of Port Royal's unstable geology.
The building went more than 15 degrees into the ground. So they call it giddy house, because when you go inside, you're tilted to one side.
The Caribbean archipelago is a geologically active area.
Jamaica sits exactly where the Caribbean plate and the Geneva microplate meet, but they meet side by side in what's called a transform fault, and this fault rubs against each other as things move, and that can cause violent juddering and earthquakes, but also some of those earthquakes can be quite shallow and cause violent changes on the Earth's surface.
So on the 7th of June, 1692, there was a devastating earthquake. 13 acres of land sank into the sea immediately.
These heavy buildings suddenly found themselves not on solid sort of sandy substrate, but on a liquid sandy substrate. What was solid land all of a sudden becomes liquid and things sink into it. And as the earthquake stopped, then the sand essentially re-solidified itself, trapping the buildings within it and even people.
2,000 people were killed almost instantly. Another 3,000 died later from disease. But that was just the beginning.
The earthquake, being coastal, also created a tsunami. And it's reported that the sea moved about a mile away from the land before then coming crashing in with violent waves that attacked the city from the seaward side.
is Fort James, and this was one of a number of forts that sank. Fort James is in about 25, 30 feet of water now. So all of that area from the old naval coming out was once land.
A letter from a survivor said, "We ran out of the house where we saw all people with hands lifted up, begging God's assistance."
The city could no longer function. It was over. Many believed this was retribution. All of the debauchery and sin wiped off the earth by God's wrath.
More than 1,000 acres of Port Royal were destroyed. The pirate capital never returned to its riotous heyday, but it was reborn a century later.
One of Britain's most celebrated naval officers was called into service here. In 1779, Horatio Nelson was put in charge of 500 men at Fort Charles.
Admiral Lord Nelson did all he could to prevent Port Royal disappearing back into the sea. This naval hospital was ingeniously designed, with large parts of the building pre-assembled in Britain before being shipped out to Jamaica.
The building itself is built, it's on a raft foundation, which means all of the columns you see are tied to each other. And it's like the building itself is afloat. And this is why, for example, it has been able to withstand more than 17 major hurricanes.
In 1907, there was another earthquake.
This earthquake was really the sort of final nail in the coffin, and after this, most people fled the town.
Mother Nature had finally claimed the infamous pirate city, consigning its nefarious secrets to the depths of Davy Jones' locker.
Marine excavation takes time and patience. And although there's been a few digs over the years, there's huge swathes of the city that have yet to be explored. So who knows what treasures still lie hidden beneath?
Now they lie abandoned, but once they were the cutting edge of engineering. There are echoes from history in these decaying structures. They remind us of terror and war, but also of great innovation and human endeavor.